I'm 32 years old, and I still remember the exact sound my mother's voice made when she told me I needed to figure out my own transportation to my minimum wage job at the local diner. It was this dismissive, almost bored tone that I'd heard my entire life whenever my needs came up. But what happened next would expose a family secret so devastating that it would change everything I thought I knew about love, fairness, and what it means to be valued by the people who are supposed to care about you most. My name is Sarah, and I'm the middle child in what everyone always called a close-knit family. My older sister Rebecca has always been the golden child. Straight A's, perfect boyfriend, college scholarship, the whole package. My younger brother Michael got the baby treatment, coddled and protected from every harsh reality. And then there was me, floating somewhere in between, working twice as hard for half the recognition. But I thought that was just normal family dynamics. I thought every family had their patterns, their roles, their unspoken hierarchies. I had no idea I was living in a carefully constructed lie that would take me 3 decades to uncover. The car incident happened during one of the most challenging periods of my life. I was 28, working at Murphy's Diner downtown, making $7.50 an hour plus tips that barely covered my rent in a studio apartment across town. I'd been walking to work for 6 months because my beat-up Honda finally gave up, and I couldn't afford the repairs, let alone a replacement. Every morning, I'd walk 45 minutes each way, rain or shine, because the bus route didn't run that early for the breakfast shift. My family knew about my situation. I'd mentioned it at Sunday dinners, asked if anyone knew about reliable used cars under $3,000, talked about how exhausting it was to walk that distance twice a day while working doubles. The responses were always the same sympathetic nods and suggestions to maybe look into getting a better job, as if I hadn't been trying. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was getting ready for my shift, checking the weather because storms were predicted, when my phone rang. It was my mom, calling earlier than usual, her voice practically vibrating with excitement. She told me she had wonderful news about Rebecca. My sister had just gotten her first real job after graduate school, a marketing position at a prestigious firm downtown. To celebrate this milestone, Mom and Dad had decided to surprise her with a brand new car. Not just any car, but a beautiful silver Toyota Camry, fully loaded with all the bells and whistles. I felt my stomach drop as she described the surprise party they'd planned, the big reveal in the driveway, how proud they were of Rebecca's achievements. I managed to congratulate her and ask appropriate questions about the job and the car, but inside I was reeling. Here I was, walking miles to work every day, and my sister was getting a $25,000 car as a congratulations gift. But the knife twist came at the end of the call. Almost as an afterthought, Mom mentioned that she'd been thinking about my transportation situation. Her advice was that I should probably look into getting a bicycle or maybe see if any of my co-workers could give me rides. She said this with the same casual tone she might use to suggest I try a new restaurant. I hung up the phone and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked tired, older than my years, with dark circles under my eyes from the physical exhaustion of my daily routine. And for the first time, I started to wonder if what I was experiencing was actually normal. That evening, I called my best friend Emma, who had been my roommate in college and knew my family well. When I told her about the car situation, there was this long pause on the other end of the line. Then she said something that stopped me cold. She told me that what my family was doing wasn't normal, that the level of disparity in how they treated me versus my siblings was actually pretty shocking to observe from the outside. Emma started listing things I'd never really connected before. How my parents had paid for Rebecca's entire college education, including her master's program, while I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for my bachelor's degree. How they'd given Michael a car for his 16th birthday, while I'd had to buy my own used Honda with money I'd saved from my summer job. How they'd helped Rebecca with the down payment on her apartment, while I'd been struggling to make rent in my studio. But the patterns went deeper than financial support. Emma reminded me about my college graduation, how my parents had scheduled a family vacation during my ceremony because Rebecca had a job interview that week. She mentioned how my achievements were always met with lukewarm responses, while my siblings' accomplishments were celebrated with elaborate parties and social media posts. The more Emma talked, the more I realized that what I'd been experiencing wasn't normal middle child syndrome. It was systematic favoritism so ingrained that I'd learned to accept it as natural. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I'd felt invisible in my own family, all the moments when I'd been told my needs weren't as important as everyone else's. I thought about birthdays where my gift budget was clearly smaller than my siblings, about family photos where I was consistently positioned at the edge, about conversations where my opinions were dismissed or ignored. But I also thought about something else. 3 years earlier, when my grandmother passed away, I'd been the one who took care of her in her final months. I'd moved back home, taken a leave of absence from work, and essentially became her full-time caregiver. My parents had been grateful, praising my dedication and selflessness. My siblings had visited occasionally but were too busy with their own lives to help with the day-to-day care. During those months, Grandma had shared stories about our family that I'd never heard before. She'd talked about how proud she was of my resilience, how she saw something special in me that reminded her of herself at my age. She'd mentioned that she had some things she wanted to make sure I received after she passed, important documents and keepsakes that she felt I'd appreciate and protect. But after her funeral, when the will was read, I discovered that my grandmother had left me significantly more than anyone else in the family. The bulk of her estate, including her house and a substantial savings account, had been left to me. My parents had seemed surprised but not upset, saying that Grandma had always been fond of me and that my care during her final months had clearly meant a lot to her. What I didn't know at the time was that my grandmother had also left detailed letters explaining her decisions, along with financial records and family documents that painted a very different picture of my family's dynamics than what I'd been led to believe. The morning after my conversation with Emma, I decided to go through my grandmother's papers more carefully. I'd been putting it off, partly because grief made it difficult, but also because I'd been so busy with work and daily survival that I hadn't had time to properly sort through everything. What I found in those boxes would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. There were bank statements showing that my parents had been receiving substantial financial help from my grandmother for years. Not just small gifts or occasional assistance, but regular transfers that had helped them maintain their lifestyle and support my siblings' educations and opportunities. The amounts were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of 2 decades. But more shocking were the letters my grandmother had written to my parents, letters that had never been sent but were clearly drafts expressing her concerns about how they were treating me. She'd noticed the favoritism, the way my achievements were minimized while my siblings were celebrated. She'd seen how I was expected to work harder for less recognition, how my needs were consistently deprioritized. In one letter, she'd written about watching me graduate college, how she'd been so proud of my accomplishments despite having to work multiple jobs to pay for school, and how disappointed she was that my parents hadn't made my education the priority they'd made Rebecca's. She'd noted that the money she'd been sending them could have easily covered my tuition, just like it had covered Rebecca's. Another letter detailed her observations during her final illness, how I'd been the only one to sacrifice my own life to care for her, while my siblings had continued their normal routines. She'd written about wanting to make sure I was properly recognized and financially secure, since it seemed like my parents hadn't prioritized my stability the way they had for Rebecca and Michael. But the most devastating document was a copy of a conversation my grandmother had recorded with my parents just months before she passed. In it, my parents had actually discussed their concerns about my life choices, their disappointment in my lack of ambition, and their belief that I needed to learn to be more independent and self-sufficient. The conversation revealed that they saw the differential treatment as appropriate, believing that I needed tougher love to motivate me, while Rebecca and Michael were more naturally driven and deserved their support. They'd discussed how helping me too much might make me dependent, while helping my siblings was an investment in their bright futures. What struck me most was how they'd talked about me like I was a disappointment they were trying to fix, rather than a daughter they loved and wanted to support. They'd described my struggles as character flaws, rather than the result of having to work so much harder than my siblings for basic necessities. Sitting in my studio apartment, surrounded by these documents, I felt like I was seeing my entire life through a completely different lens. The casual cruelty of telling me to walk to work while buying Rebecca a new car wasn't just thoughtlessness, it was part of a systematic pattern of treating me as less worthy of care and support. But alongside the pain came something else: validation. My grandmother had seen exactly what I'd been experiencing. She'd documented it, worried about it, and ultimately tried to correct it through her will. I wasn't being overly sensitive or ungrateful. I was being systematically undervalued by people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. That weekend, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to confront my family, not with anger or accusations, but with the truth. I was going to show them exactly what they'd been doing and give them a chance to understand the impact of their choices. I called a family meeting, something I'd never done before. I told them I had some things to discuss about Grandma's estate and some family matters that needed to be addressed. They agreed to meet at my parents' house on Sunday, probably expecting some administrative details about inherited items or paperwork. When everyone gathered in the living room, I could feel the familiar dynamic immediately. Rebecca was showing off her new car keys, talking about her job and her plans. Michael was updating everyone on his latest promotion. My parents were beaming with pride, asking detailed questions about their achievements and future prospects. When the conversation naturally shifted to me, I was asked about work with that slightly pitying tone I'd heard my whole life. How was the restaurant job going? Was I thinking about looking for something with better opportunities? The questions carried an undertone of disappointment, as if my current situation was somehow a personal failing rather than a result of circumstances. That's when I pulled out the documents. I started with my grandmother's letters, reading sections aloud that detailed her observations about the family dynamics. I watched my parents' faces change as they realized someone outside their carefully constructed narrative had been paying attention, had noticed the patterns they'd convinced themselves were normal. Then I showed them the financial records. The bank statements revealing how much help they'd been receiving from my grandmother, help that had enabled them to support Rebecca's education and Michael's opportunities while telling me I needed to be more self-sufficient. I laid out the math clearly and calmly. The amount my grandmother had sent them over the years was more than enough to have covered my college tuition, helped me with transportation, or supported me during the months I'd cared for her. Instead, that money had gone to maintaining a lifestyle that allowed them to be generous with my siblings while withholding support from me. The room was completely silent as I explained how I'd been walking to work while they'd been discussing Rebecca's new car, how I'd been eating ramen noodles for dinner while they'd been planning elaborate celebrations for my siblings' achievements, how I'd been struggling to pay rent while they'd been helping Rebecca with her apartment down payment. My father was the first to speak. He tried to explain that they'd been trying to help me develop independence, that they'd thought I was stronger and more capable of handling challenges on my own. He said they'd been proud of my resilience but hadn't realized I'd interpreted their approach as lack of support. My mother added that they'd never meant to hurt me, that they'd been trying to prepare me for the real world in a way that wouldn't be necessary for Rebecca and Michael. She said they'd seen my struggles as character building, not as neglect. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the recording of their conversation with my grandmother, the one where they'd discussed their disappointment in my choices and their belief that I needed tougher love. I played the sections where they'd described helping me as potentially harmful, while describing support for my siblings as investments in their futures. Hearing their own words played back to them was clearly devastating. They couldn't deny what they'd said, couldn't reframe it as misunderstanding or good intentions. They'd been caught expressing their true feelings about me in a moment when they'd thought no one was listening. Rebecca and Michael were stunned. They'd never realized the extent of the differential treatment because they'd been the beneficiaries of it. They'd assumed that I'd chosen to be more independent, that I'd preferred to handle things on my own. The systematic nature of the favoritism had been invisible to them because they'd been living inside the privileged side of it. But what came next was the most painful part of the entire confrontation. Instead of genuine remorse or attempts to understand the impact of their actions, my parents became defensive. They started listing all the ways they had supported me, all the times they'd been there for me, all the love they'd shown me throughout my life. They couldn't seem to grasp that love without equity isn't really love at all. They couldn't understand that saying they loved me while systematically providing fewer resources, opportunities, and support was actually a form of emotional abuse. The conversation ended with my mother in tears, saying that she'd never intended to hurt me and that she couldn't believe I thought they loved me less than my siblings. My father was angry, saying that I was being ungrateful and that they'd done the best they could with the resources they'd had. But I'd found my voice in a way I never had before. I told them that intent doesn't negate impact, that good intentions don't excuse harmful actions, and that love isn't just a feeling. It's a practice that requires consistent care and support. I explained that I wasn't asking for apologies or explanations. I was asking for acknowledgement that their treatment of me had been unfair and harmful, and for genuine commitment to changing their behavior going forward. The response was exactly what I'd expected but had hoped wouldn't happen. They couldn't do it. They couldn't acknowledge the systematic nature of their favoritism because it would require admitting that they'd been poor parents to me for 30 years. Instead, they doubled down on their narrative that they'd been trying to help me develop strength and independence. They maintained that their approach had been different but not wrong, that they'd been preparing me for a harder world while protecting my siblings from unnecessary struggles. That's when I realized that the conversation was over. Not because we'd reached understanding, but because they were incapable of the kind of honest self-reflection that would be required to repair our relationship. I gathered my documents and stood up to leave. Before I walked out, I told them exactly what would happen next. I would no longer be participating in family dynamics that required me to accept less than I deserved. I would no longer be attending family gatherings where my achievements were minimized while my siblings were celebrated. I would no longer be available to provide care and support while receiving dismissal and neglect in return. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me, they would need to demonstrate through their actions that they valued me as much as they valued Rebecca and Michael. Words wouldn't be enough anymore. I needed to see consistent, equitable treatment and genuine acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused. The silence that followed was deafening. No one tried to stop me as I walked out. No one called after me or asked me to reconsider. They just sat there, probably telling themselves that I was being dramatic or unreasonable. But something amazing happened in the weeks that followed. Without the constant drain of trying to earn love that was never going to be given freely, I found energy I hadn't had in years. I started looking for better job opportunities, networking with people in my field, and investing in my own professional development. Within 3 months, I'd landed a position at a marketing firm that paid 3 times what I'd been making at the diner. The job came with benefits, vacation time, and opportunities for advancement. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck. With my improved financial situation, I was able to move into a better apartment, buy a reliable car, and start building the kind of life I'd always wanted but never believed was possible for me. More importantly, I was building it on my own terms, without having to beg for scraps of support from people who'd never valued my potential. My siblings reached out occasionally, confused by my absence from family events and concerned about the ongoing tension. When I explained my perspective, Rebecca was the first to acknowledge that she'd been blind to the favoritism. She admitted that she'd always taken the support for granted and had never questioned why I seemed to struggle more than she did. Michael took longer to understand, but eventually he too recognized the patterns. Both of them apologized for their role in the dynamic, even though they'd been children when it started and had simply accepted it as normal. But my parents remained unchanged. They continued to view my boundaries as punishment rather than protection. They told extended family members that I was going through a difficult phase, that I was being influenced by outside perspectives, that I would eventually come around and realize how much they'd always loved me. The breakthrough came about a year later, during a family crisis that forced them to confront their own narrative. Michael had been in a serious car accident and was hospitalized for several weeks. During his recovery, he needed extensive care and support, and my parents found themselves overwhelmed by the demands of caregiving. Rebecca was living in another state by then, busy with her career and unable to provide hands-on help. They found themselves in exactly the situation I'd been in when I'd cared for my grandmother, except this time they were the ones struggling with the physical and emotional demands of supporting someone they loved. That's when they called me. Not to apologize or acknowledge their past behavior, but to ask for help. They needed someone to stay with Michael during the day while they worked, someone to help with medical appointments and physical therapy, someone to provide the kind of dedicated care that I'd given to my grandmother. The request was made with the same casual expectation that had characterized their treatment of me my entire life. They assumed I would drop everything to help, that my job and my life were less important than their needs, that I would sacrifice my own stability to solve their problems. But I wasn't the same person who had walked to work every day while they bought cars for my siblings. I wasn't the same person who had accepted crumbs of affection while watching them shower my siblings with support and recognition. I told them I would be happy to help, but that my assistance would come with conditions. I would need to be compensated for my time at the same rate I was making at my job, since I would need to take leave to provide care. I would need them to arrange backup support for times when I wasn't available, since I couldn't be expected to provide 24-hour care indefinitely. And most importantly, I would need them to acknowledge that asking for this level of support while having systematically withheld support from me was problematic. Their response was immediate and predictable. They were hurt that I would ask for payment to help my own brother. They were shocked that I would impose conditions on family support. They couldn't understand why I was being so cold and calculating about a family crisis, but I held firm. I explained that I'd learned from their example that support within our family came with expectations and conditions. I'd learned that some family members' needs were prioritized over others, that some people were expected to give more than they received, and that equity wasn't a consideration in how resources were distributed. I told them that if they wanted my help, they would need to treat me the same way they'd always treated Rebecca and Michael, with respect, appreciation, and fair compensation for my contributions. The conversation ended with my father calling me selfish and my mother saying she didn't recognize the person I'd become. They said they would figure out Michael's care on their own, that they didn't need help from someone who would put conditions on family support. But within a week, they called back. They'd realized that managing Michael's care while maintaining their jobs and their own health was impossible without help. They'd looked into professional care services and discovered that the cost would be significant. They'd asked Rebecca to take leave from her job, but she'd explained that she couldn't afford to lose income during her first year at the firm. This time, when they called, the conversation was different. They were humbled by the reality of their situation, forced to acknowledge that they needed me more than I needed them. They agreed to my conditions, though they clearly resented having to do so. The 3 months I spent helping with Michael's recovery were transformative for all of us. Working together daily, my parents couldn't maintain their narrative that I was selfish or ungrateful. They saw firsthand the level of care and dedication I brought to supporting family members, the same qualities I'd shown when caring for my grandmother. More importantly, they began to understand the cost of that care. When I had to miss work events for medical appointments, they saw how it impacted my professional development. When I was exhausted from long days of caregiving, they saw how it affected my personal life. When I had to decline social invitations because of my responsibilities, they began to understand the sacrifices I'd made throughout my life to support our family. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they began to treat me differently. They started asking about my job with genuine interest rather than veiled disappointment. They began including me in family decisions and seeking my opinions on important matters. They started acknowledging my contributions and expressing appreciation for my efforts. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was consistent. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was being seen and valued as an equal member of the family, rather than as someone who needed to earn their love through service and sacrifice. The real turning point came when Michael was fully recovered and no longer needed daily care. My parents asked me to stay for dinner, something they'd never done during the months I'd been helping. But this time, the invitation felt different. It felt like they actually wanted my company, not just my assistance. During that dinner, my father did something I'd never experienced before. He thanked me, not just for helping with Michael's care, but for everything I'd done throughout my life to support our family. He acknowledged that he'd taken my contributions for granted, and that he'd failed to recognize how much I'd sacrificed to be there for everyone else. My mother followed with her own acknowledgement. She said she'd been thinking about our conversation the year before, about the patterns I'd pointed out and the impact of their choices. She said she'd been defensive because facing the truth about their treatment of me was too painful, but that watching me care for Michael had forced her to confront her own behavior. She told me she was proud of the person I'd become, not in spite of the challenges I'd faced, but because of how I'd handled them. She said she'd realized that her attempts to toughen me up had actually been a form of neglect, and that my strength and resilience were my own achievements, not the result of their parenting strategy. But the most meaningful moment came when they asked for my forgiveness. Not the kind of performative apology designed to make them feel better, but a genuine acknowledgement of harm and a commitment to doing better going forward. I told them that forgiveness wasn't something I could give in a single moment, but something that would have to be rebuilt through consistent actions over time. I explained that I was willing to work on repairing our relationship, but that it would require ongoing effort from all of us to break the patterns that had damaged our family for so long. That was 3 years ago. Our relationship today isn't perfect, but it's honest. My parents have worked to treat me with the same respect and support they've always shown my siblings. They've acknowledged the impact of their past behavior and made genuine efforts to change their approach to our family dynamic. More importantly, I've learned to value myself independently of their approval. I've built a life that reflects my own priorities and values, surrounded by people who appreciate and support me consistently. I've established boundaries that protect my energy and emotional well-being, and I've stopped accepting less than I deserve from anyone. The car that started this whole journey seems insignificant now compared to everything I've gained. I drive a reliable vehicle that I bought with my own money from a job that values my contributions. But more than that, I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how others choose to treat me, but by how I choose to treat myself. If you're watching this and recognizing similar patterns in your own family, I want you to know that you're not imagining things. Favoritism is real, and its impact on your self-worth and life opportunities is significant. You deserve to be valued and supported, not because you've earned it through exceptional service or sacrifice, but because you're a human being worthy of love and respect. Setting boundaries with family members who've systematically undervalued you isn't selfish. It's necessary for your emotional health and personal growth. You don't have to accept less than you deserve just because someone is related to you. You don't have to be grateful for scraps of affection while watching others receive abundant support. The journey from recognizing favoritism to establishing healthy boundaries is difficult and often painful. It requires you to let go of the fantasy that your family will suddenly change and start treating you the way you've always deserved to be treated. It requires you to value yourself enough to demand better treatment, even when that demand is met with resistance or rejection. But on the other side of that journey is a life where you're valued for who you are, not for what you can provide. A life where your achievements are celebrated, your struggles are supported, and your worth is never questioned. A life where you're surrounded by people who choose to love you consistently and equitably. That life is possible for you, just like it became possible for me. It starts with recognizing that you deserve better and ends with creating the kind of relationships and circumstances that reflect your true value. Have you experienced favoritism in your own family? How did you handle it, and what advice would you give to others in similar situations? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences is the first step toward healing and change. And if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with others who might need to hear that their experiences are valid and that change is possible. Building a community of support for people who've experienced family dysfunction is one of the most important things we can do for each other. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how others choose to treat you. You deserve love, support, and respect, and you have the power to create a life that reflects those values. The journey isn't easy, but it's worth every step.